Hello and welcome, everyone, to what, due to weather and all sorts of other things, is our second third Thursday of the entire semester as we're rounding out into Thanksgiving. So, so it goes. I'm going to give you a talk about fairy tales, and then we're going to discuss some fairy tales. And I'm really excited because this is a thing that I nerd out on really hard. And hopefully you will end up sharing my enjoyment and delight as well. In a culture that will tell you not to live with your head in the clouds. In a culture that spits out, "That's a myth," when trying to discount a patent falsehood. In a culture that is quick to point out, "This isn't a fairy tale, it's real life." I am here to be countercultural. I come as an ambassador of fairyland. I come as a champion of myth. I come as a rationally minded instructor of symbolic logic with an MA in philosophy, preaching the following message: we need to spend more time with our head in the clouds. Chances are you're already a bit prone to escapism. Our political landscape is full of fragmented and discordant discourse. Our metropolitan landscape is full of smog and stark utilitarian architecture. Our extended families are fighting on Facebook, and the monotony of daily life can sometimes leave a residual hunger pang for adventure. It is no wonder that in a daily existence wherein beauty, goodness, and truth are constantly shrouded from us, we tend towards dissatisfaction and the desire for escape, whether we escape into Netflix, social media, or silly iPhone games. Escape tends to get a bad rap. Folks often associate it, especially escapes from daily life, with a sort of lazy cowardice that refuses to accept reality. But just as public approval does not necessarily denote virtue, neither does public ridicule necessarily denote vice. In his essay on fairy stories, J.R.R. Tolkien defends a certain type of escape, posing the reader with the question: why should a man be scorned if, finding himself in prison, he tries to get out and go home? Or, if when he cannot do so, he thinks and talks about other topics than jailers and prison walls. The world outside has not become less real because the prisoner cannot see it. Now, you may be thinking that's all well and good for the man who awakes in prison, but normal daily life isn't in fact a prison sentence. That's kind of dramatic. To this, Tolkien responds with what is perhaps even more startling of a statement. The electric street lamp may indeed be ignored, simply because it is so insignificant and transient. Fairy stories, at any rate, have many more permanent and fundamental things to talk about. The notion that motor cars are more alive than, say, centaurs or dragons is curious. That they are more real than, say, horses is pathetically absurd. Tolkien anticipates the objection, but grants it no force. In Tolkien's view, the modern man is indeed trapped in a prison, surrounded by what is insignificant and transient. He desires to escape because he desires more reality, a desire that is both natural and healthy. It is not delusion, but realism that causes him to run. Hold on, you might be thinking. How could a fairy tale possibly be more real than a street lamp? You're speaking nonsense. To the taste of the contemporary critic, Tolkien's ontology is foreign and bizarre. In an age of assumed materialism, ontological systems that place the metaphysical above the physical seem perhaps upside down. Tolkien, however, cares very little about what the contemporary critic might think. His arguments resound with the voice of Narnia's Professor Kirk, a character created by his dear friend C.S. Lewis. It's all in Plato, all in Plato. Bless me, what do they teach them at these schools? So to understand why fairy tales might be more real than electric street lamps, one needs to understand a rough sketch of Plato's ontology. A rough sketch. Okay. It was really hard for me to even just write that sentence. So if you were here for our first Third Thursday symposium, someone else has also tried to do this, I'll be repeating and reiterating a bit of what Mr. Muller said about Platonic ontology. So forgive me if I'm being repetitive, but I find that I often need refreshers on the finer points of complex philosophical ideas. So it goes. For Plato, all things fall into one of two categories: being and becoming. Things that fall into the first category, or the things that are, let's call them the forms for the sake of this conversation, are those sorts of things that do not admit change. They are eternal, unchanging, and are only ever what they are. So the number 4, the color red, the virtue justice, They all fall into this category. 4, as an idea, is eternal and unchanging. When a person counts objects, whether their counting occurs 1,000 years ago or 1,000 years hence, 2 and 2 together will make 4. Now, languages will change, right? You might use different words to say those types of things, but the idea of 4 will always be such that you can come to it by the combination of 2 2s, whatever our words are for those things. It will always be, and it can only be, itself. Math doesn't work if 4 can also express 3 while still being 4. This way also goes red and justice and all of these other ideas. Everything else for Plato falls into the category of becoming. These objects, those which are coming to be, do not possess eternality like the forms. Neither are they unchanging or wholly themselves. The black metallic electric lamp on my desk is not an eternal object. I can easily imagine the future wherein it does not exist, but it certainly seems to exist now. This, according to Plato, is because it images the forms in which it participates, and in doing so has something like existence. It exhibits black, metallic, electric, and lamp, but is not itself those things. It is one of many lamps fashioned after the idea of lamp that will one day cease to be a lamp at all. How then could it be more important than the idea of lamp? If I lose the lamp that is currently on my desk, I can buy another one. But if we lose track of lamp itself, the idea of lamp, how could more lamps be made? Therein, for Plato, lies the tyranny of the physical world. It arrests our attention and convinces us of its reality, while itself being a mere shadow that passes away. The ideas reflected by our world are real and true and immortal, but the physical world itself is a transient vanity. To abandon that which is, for that which is coming to be but never is, right, that which is, the form things, that which is coming to be but never is, like this stuff. Where was I? To do that is to, as the author of Ecclesiastes would say, strive after the wind. This is the demand of a world that scorns the escape of the fairy tale in favor of reality of our current world. Our current world's reality is lesser, so an escape from it is into something more real. For Tolkien, the world of fairy tales is an appropriate escape from the tyranny of the physical world. While it is easy to mistake the reality of our day-to-day lives with true reality, it is difficult to do so with the fairy tale. The fairy tale, however, is crafted with true reality ever in mind. The author's imagination creates the fairy tale world through consideration of and interaction with the forms, its existence in the author's mind being an image of those forms. This world then finds existence in the mind of the reader as he constructs an image of those forms brought about by the words of the tale. The words on the page are not themselves fairyland, they are ink on paper. But these words, when read, call the reader to create an image of reality through his own imagination, thus bringing him into closer contact with that which is. Our desire for escape is sensible and right. We desire a world more real than our own, and fairy stories provide a way for us to find it and dwell in it. The question that remains, then, is whether we should, in fact, dwell in the fairy tale world. If you've been tracking my argument, you hopefully agree that I've shown why we want to escape to fairyland. I've shown that this desire is natural, based around our inherent love of that which is real in the Platonic sense. But I have not yet shown that to dwell in fairyland provides tangible benefit for the man of this world. All well and good, you may be thinking, to want things to be better, but they aren't. So why should we who live in the real world leave it in order to dwell in another realm? To answer this question, and I think it's a very good one, I'll turn once again to Plato. We've already done a lot of Plato, so this is now going to be a Platonic lightning round. Bear with me. I promise I did not intentionally write a talk about fairy tales that's secretly about Plato. It just turns out that pretty much everything is about Plato. It's not my fault that he's already considered every important philosophical topic in the world. Blame him, not me. So, again, we're going to go really fast. I'm going to butcher it. Go read Plato for yourselves. This is not a good intro to Plato class. This is just me mentioning really quickly what these ideas are. So, in Plato's Republic, Socrates, together with his interlocutors, look for the nature of justice. They want to know, ultimately, what a just soul looks like. What they discover is that a just man is set up as follows. the rational part, your head, governs over the appetitive part, your belly, through the spirited part, your chest, your heart. I said that and then said that I was going to point to that afterwards, but I did it the first time. So head, heart, chest, or head, heart, stomach. So dieting exhibits the nature of this relationship really well. When you're on a diet, what do you want? If you're Lily, you want ice cream. If you're me, you want French fries. It just depends on whether you're a sweets person or a carbs person. What do you reasonably know, like in your head, that you should abstain from when you're on a diet? Ice cream or French fries. Does knowledge alone, the knowledge that you shouldn't eat ice cream, stop you from eating ice cream? Certainly not. It takes a third thing to enforce the dictates of reason amongst our unruly appetites. This thing is what Plato calls the spirit, and it is essential for virtue formation. If the spirit is properly allied with reason, the soul is well governed and virtuous. But if the spirit is allied with the appetites, there's nothing our reason can do to establish control. I don't know about you, but I certainly don't want to be the sort of person controlled entirely by my appetites. I've met those people, and they aren't great. But to be controlled by reason requires a spirited nature that is aligned with reason. This alignment cannot occur by mere aphorism. To simply tell it to behave has no effect. It is not an inherently intellectual part of the soul. It's not the intellect. And thus it cannot be educated on an intellectual basis. It requires instead an emotional education based in habituation and affinity. I'd argue that the soul that spends a good deal of time wandering the wilds of fairyland stands a good chance to have a spirited part that loves what's good. George MacDonald discusses the emotional weight of the fairy tale in his essay, The Fantastic Imagination. I quote it here at length. It is very seldom indeed that words carry the exact meaning of any user of them. And if they can be so used as to convey definite meaning, it does not follow that they ought never to carry anything else. Words are live things that may be variously employed to various ends. They can convey a scientific fact, or throw a shadow of her child's dream on the heart of a mother. They are things to put together like the pieces of a dissected map, or to arrange like the notes on a stave. Is the music in them to go for nothing? It can hardly help the definiteness of a meaning. Is it therefore to be disregarded? They have length and breadth and outline. Have they nothing to do with depth? Have they only to describe, never to impress? Has nothing any claim to their use but the definite? The cause of a child's tears may be altogether undefinable. Has the mother therefore no antidote for his vague misery? That may be strong in color which has no evident outline. A fairy tale, a sonata, a gathering storm, a limitless night, seizes you and sweeps you away. Fairy tales, like all good art, cannot be easily explained, but can be easily felt. The fairy tale, like a painting or a concerto, is not created in order to communicate propositional truth. That's why this talk is not simply a list of virtues that one can learn from reading fairy tales. Snow White, Cinderella, Beauty and the Beast, Little Mermaid. These tales all teach moral lessons, but they don't do it because they have a neat little wrap-up at the end. No one was ever really convinced of the importance of virtue by reading an interpretation of a fairy tale that gives its supposed lesson, reduced down to an easy aphorism. No, it is the effect of the tale as a whole, the emotional climate in which the tale baptizes the whole soul, which gets at the true nature of the fairy tale. And it is because of this that fairy tales are such potent tools for spirit education. How do you teach the part of the student that can't learn by words alone? Fairy tales are an answer, and in my estimation, a very good one. They are works of art that create an emotional landscape, bathed in goodness, truth, and beauty, that the hearer of the tale can explore. This emphasis on experience and impression is why fairy tales are so effective at reaching the spirit. Of course, any piece of emotionally charged storytelling can reach the spirited part of the soul. Often, emotionally charged content inflames our passions to obey our appetites rather than our reason, to nurture vice rather than virtue. Attractive things, things that appear beautiful, are dangerous when not paired together with what is true and good. This is why the connection between the world of fairy and the world of forms is so important. Fairyland is not merely an emotionally engaging environment. Rather, it is an emotionally engaging environment created on the basis of what is true and good. One cannot simply immerse themselves in intense emotional experiences in order to become virtuous. The laws that hold in the midst of those emotional experiences inform their value for proper spirit education. There are only 2 laws in Fairyland, and I think they address this exact problem. The first, which G.K. Chesterton points out in his book Orthodoxy, is that Fairyland must be rational. The laws of reason hold in Fairyland just as they do everywhere else. If the wicked stepmother is Cinderella's stepmother, then Cinderella, God bless her, is the wicked stepmother's stepdaughter. This is a rule of logic. What doesn't hold in Fairyland, however, are physical, scientific laws. As Chesterton points out, we have always in our fairy tales kept a sharp distinction between the science of mental relations, in which there really are laws, and the science of physical facts, in which there are no laws but only weird repetitions. In Fairyland, wolves' stomachs can hold 2 whole people without much discomfort. Birds can talk when they need to warn you of danger, and ringing a bell when you're told not to will wake an evil queen and bring evil to the land. None of these things are irrational, they just don't happen very often in our world. Instead, we experience bizarre phenomena like things falling every time you let go of them, apples growing from trees, and sounds rising in pitch as they travel towards you. These things are just as bizarre as those that occur in Fairyland. We're simply used to them. Ultimately, then, Fairyland provides a clearer distinction between the rational and irrational. That which holds in both our world and in Fairyland tends to be rational. That which shocks us in Fairyland is often just as shocking as our world here. The absence of our scientific law in Fairyland, however, opens it up to Fairyland's second type of law, that which, together with the rational law, helps inform our sensibilities as we explore Fairyland. I'm speaking, of course, of moral law. This law remains rigid in Fairyland. And as it often replaces scientific law in the place, it shines perhaps more clearly there than it does here. As MacDonald writes, "It were no offense to suppose a world in which everything repelled instead of attracting the things around it. It would be wicked to write a tale representing a man it called good as always doing bad things, or a man it called bad as always doing good things. The notion itself is absolutely lawless." This moral law, which rules in Fairyland alongside reason, appears with shocking clarity when not muddled by the complexities of that which is coming to be, but never is. Remember Plato, it's all in Plato. The distractions that Lewis warns us about simply don't exist in Fairyland. Or at least in Fairyland, only very evil characters pay much attention to them. Fairyland is a simple place ruled by simple rules. That which is logically necessary remains logically necessary. That which is morally necessary remains morally necessary. Everything else is free to the imagination of the author. But as it turns out, the exploration of this simple place is exactly what the spirited part of our nature needs. The perfect place to learn to love goodness and hate wickedness is a place where good is good and bad is bad. There are no gray areas or places of moral uncertainty in Fairyland. Is it good to eat little children? No. Not even if you're a giant or a lonely witch. Should we feel sorry for the witch because she is hungry and lonely? No. She's eating children. I will pause here to lodge a complaint with Disney. In recent years, especially with Frozen, which is an abominable excuse for a fairy tale film, Disney seems to have utterly forgotten its roots in order to bow to the trend of tragic backstory that reframes a villain as simply misunderstood. The fairy tale is as effective as it is largely due to the simplicity of its moral code. It functions and thrives on the clear moral laws that govern Fairyland. If the purpose of the fairy tale is to educate the spirit, as I contend that it is, then muddying the waters between good and evil can succeed only in muddying the moral clarity of the audience's spirit. This seems to me an exceptionally wicked thing to do. The whole goal of the fairy tale is to form the spirit through a baptism in clear moral truth, governed by the dictates of reason. We have enough media and literature that shows us how complicated the world is. I wish Disney would keep it out of fairy tales. Anyway, the moral truths of fairy tales don't require syllogisms or complex arguments to be understood, but it takes a good deal of time dwelling with them before they are felt. Through interacting with fairy tales time and again, the spirited part of our nature takes to the moral truths of Fairyland and adopts them as its own. In this way, through interacting with Fairyland, a place ruled by right and reason, the spirit learns to love what is good and hate what is evil, to fight for virtue and battle down vice. Fairy tales are essential to this end, as moral truths cannot be felt with any degree of force by mere argument. The spirit is an emotional part of the soul and requires an emotional education in order to love what it ought. And if the spirit does not learn to love what it ought, it will not fulfill its proper function. The appetites of man are voracious and volatile. They cannot be reined in by reason alone. One needs a strong spirit to fight his own vice, to develop a virtuous character. We must tell ourselves, tell our children, story after story after story of brave maidens and clever princes, of talking wolves and mischievous pixies, of pain and redemption and grace and sacrifice. We must dwell amongst the best things until they are fond and familiar friends. If we can learn to love the best things, we might flourish and do well. The fairy story will save us if our spirits are persuaded by it. Thank you.